Hello, everyone. Welcome to our class. And although you might be viewing this recording at different times from the rest of your class, but still, I would like to greet you good morning or good afternoon, whatever time you are viewing this, even good evening. I hope you are well today, and it is my hope that this presentation will help you better internalize and understand the lessons and the concepts that were first presented in the article that I have written together with my former professor and mentor. So, why did we mainly focus on listening and speaking? The article is entitled Teaching ESOL, that is English to Speakers of Other Languages, Listening and Speaking. As you know, free speech is like the highest level when it comes to language learning. So, the ability to communicate freely and with a lot of ease means that the person or the language learner has already acquired to a certain level of proficiency the target language. And so it is very important that we take time, that we give time to study how can we best teach English to speakers of other languages, meaning speakers or language learners are studying English as their second language or their foreign language or just their added language. And this discussion mainly focuses and targets listening and speaking. So let us start our presentation. Before, let us review the brief history of teaching oral skills. Long time ago, centuries ago, although the study and the teaching of foreign language has already begun, the teaching of listening and speaking did not begin right away. What does this mean? It means that the main focus for studying a foreign language, in particular the classic language like Latin or Greek, mainly focuses on learning the language so that they can read it. Okay, they can understand the reading. So for centuries, language was taught using rote learning. So just practice, just drills. Mainly the first time language or a foreign language was taught is for them or for the learners to be able to uh, understand what was written in that specific language. So if you know the history of the language teaching approaches and methods, it's grammar translation. They learn a foreign language by translating the target language to their native language or their native language to their target language. And if ever there is instruction on speaking or listening, oral practice was limited to students reading aloud the sentences they had translated. So whatever they have translated, I just read it aloud. That's it. So when did they actually begin studying how to speak the target language? World War II became the driving force. We use the word impetus for that. Speaking and pronunciation were largely taught through imitation during World War II. This is when audiolingual method became popular. In fact, it was also known as the army method because it began with the armies. So now, World War II, there's war between different countries, in particular Allied versus Axis countries. They needed that ability to speak the language not only of their allies but also of their enemies. So how can they learn that foreign language? They learned it by focusing on pronunciation. So pronunciation is very important, and so they always had drills. Hence, speaking and pronunciation were the two main focus of language teaching and learning during this time. And after that, there were several language methods and approaches that were introduced. Many of them, some of you have taken the time to review them and you were able to create an infographic about it. So congratulations to those who did that. But basically, you have the silent method, where this time the teacher is silent and it's the learner's responsibility to take charge of their own learning. Then you have the natural approach, where the teacher is the main source of comprehensible input, but at the same time, the learner is immersed in the target language and learn the language in a similar way that the first language or the native language was learned. Then you have Suggestopedia, where it was not mentioned probably in the article, but Suggestopedia is you just suggest, meaning there's not much stress. The idea here is students should be relaxed when they're studying a language. So music is used a lot to relax the mind of students and then to help them, come up with the object or the task of the lesson. And then there's communicative language teaching, or if you want to pronounce the word as communicative, that's also okay. But both pronunciation, by the way, is acceptable. Communicative or communicative. So when that one, because as time goes by, we realize, or linguists realize, that learning a foreign language is not just to achieve native like proficiency. The main goal for language learning is communicative competence. That is to have each language learner communicate in the target language. And so now students or language learners are given opportunities and avenues to communicate using the language. So it's not just that you study the language structure, the grammar competence or linguistic competence, but you have to practice so you can achieve communicative competence. And so with this several approaches, a balanced approach is needed, meaning that teachers can use various approach or methods, but it is important to have a good foundation of the theories, because without that, it would be difficult to choose the correct technique for what to use in the language classroom. So in order to better understand how do you approach the teaching of speaking and listening in the language classroom, it's important that it's clear to you some of these theoretical underpinnings when it comes to second language acquisition or the teaching of English to speakers of other languages. First, we have to know the context. ESL versus EFL. Although we say English to speakers of other languages, that is a more inclusive term. But wherever you are teaching, wherever the students are learning the target language, you have to identify whether it's an ESL or EFL. When we say ESL, so if you know Kachru's circle, ESL is where English is used as a second language. EFL is English is used as a foreign language. So let's say if you're here in the Philippines, most likely that's an ESL setting. And if you are studying English in China or in South Korea, then that you're studying English in an EFL setting. So where and in what context does the language learning take place? If language learners are studying English, let's say in China, then they would need more instruction, more opportunities to practice the target language, or in this case, English, inside their classroom. Most likely, they will not feel very motivated to speak well because anyway, when they go out, they don't need to use it. Unlike with people who study English here in the Philippines, of course, they cannot use their native language. When they go out, they had to utilize English. So the motivation to speak the language is higher, much more so if language learners went to, let's say, the United States or New Zealand or Australia or in England, where English is the main language that is used in that specific country or area. So there's a different need depending on the context, depending on the place where the language learner is. So it's important that you understand as a language teacher where you are and where your students are, so you can better provide and assist them with the necessary practice and support while inside the classroom. Next is variability. Variable, we already discussed and considered some of the SLA variables. But basically, when say variable, the differences, okay? No single skill makes or breaks a person's ability to learn a new language. How old is the person learning a language? What is his or her personality? Um, what else? What is his or her experience prior to joining your class? Whether they have a good or traumatic or interesting experience in learning an English language, they will definitely bring that when they go and join your class. And so these differences in their needs and their purpose and their goals for studying the English language will affect how they progress in their lessons in the class. And so it's important as a teacher that you are aware of where your students come from. So even if you cannot answer all their needs, you might have a good understanding and can design better strategies to help support them in their language learning. Natural order hypothesis. This is one of Stephen Krashen's hypotheses, in that he hypothesized that some language structures are learned earlier than the others. Usually, the easier they are, they learn it even without instruction. And this implication to teaching speaking and listening, or listening and speaking, is that learners will not be able to master certain sounds at early stages. So there is no sense in focusing on them. So example, you know that this sound is really difficult, and so it's important that the language learners learn such a specific sound. Okay, and that makes sense. But if they are still beginners in their language learning journey, sometimes they are not ready to learn that specific sound. The same way with children. Like with children, usually it's the bilabial p, ma, b that they learn first. So there's no sense teaching them how to pronounce, let's say, letter Z, like zoo, first, because they're just simply not ready. It's the same thing even with adults and when teaching listening and speaking. What else? Acquisition versus learning. Again, another hypothesis of Krashen. A balance of these two aspects are needed in the language classroom. We cannot really say that although Krashen said acquisition is better than learning, but when teaching adults, adults prefer learning. They want certain structure. They don't like to be just exposed there outside and just communicate. Children are more comfortable just using the language with their peers, but adults, unless they are ready with the vocabulary, they have the basic of grammar, they know exactly how to pronounce, most likely they will feel embarrassed or shy to speak. So it's important to give them the basics. Speaking takes time. So adult learners specifically, they need to know grammar. They need to know enough vocabulary to participate in that specific communicative task. And then they also need to learn how to pronounce the words properly before they can attempt such tasks. So as a teacher, it's important that we prepare them for that task. But at the same time, we also give them some opportunities for free speech. So not only do they learn the language, they will also have the opportunity to acquire it when they are given communicative tasks. So they don't only master grammar, they don't only learn about pronunciation through drills, but they can communicate ideas more meaningfully when given the chance to do so. So sometimes role plays or bringing them outside the classroom and to engage with others or giving them a more authentic task would help with the acquisition part of the learning or of the language development process. And then comprehensible input. Again, this is from Stephen Krashen, but at the same time, it's from the teachings of Lev Vygotsky, ZPD, where, okay, it's important that there's the more knowledgeable other. Okay, MKO, who supports the language learner, in this case, the teacher or their classmate who has higher level of language proficiency. So students cannot listen, understand, or retain something they cannot comprehend. So it's important that when we give them input, whether it's for listening or for reading, it's just I+1, one level beyond their current learning level. Because again, how can they remember something that they can't understand? But we go to the next issue, retention. It doesn't mean that because they can understand, it's I+1, it's good comprehensible input, they will be able to remember it. Retention is not automatic with comprehension in language learners, meaning that sometimes, especially with listening and speaking, most of the effort is already put, the mental powers are already put in understanding a specific text or understanding, let's say, a news report, that after they have finished that task, they have understood it, but they can seem to remember a thing. So this is also the same reason why, although I have given you that article to read, not everyone, depending on their level, proficiency level, will remember some of the aspects there. So I'm repeating it for you, hopefully to support your retention of the more important aspects. That's the reason also why you keep hearing about Krashen's hypotheses. And even here, we repeat it again, acquisition versus learning, a natural order, comprehensible input. Hopefully, with a lot of repetition, it will help support retention, because I know you have understood these concepts, but unless it's been repeated, your retention power may not be sufficient, because most of your mental powers were used to comprehend the text. Okay, so repetition is important for you or for the language learners to retain important information. Then we have communicative language teaching, or again, you might say, you might prefer, or some of your teachers might prefer communicative language teaching. Achieving communicative proficiency is the ultimate goal of today's language teaching and learning. And that's the reason why CLT is one of the common approaches used in the classroom. But if you're reading recent literature, there's now what we call post-method era, in that teachers don't just use a certain approach. We first have to ensure what's the need of the student, and then what's their purpose also and goal for language teaching, and then we utilize a certain approach. We don't give or prescribe a specific approach. Instead, we see first the need, and then we use various approach as needed. Levels of acquisition. Scaffold the learning process, as partially learned skills will often appear to drop out when a student expresses himself or herself orally. What does it mean? It means that sometimes, again, it's about comprehension and retention. There are specific features in a language that was already learned or acquired. But when it comes to speaking, it's not yet. You cannot see it there. Or think of yourself when you studied English earlier or at first. You already learned specific grammar. And then when the teacher asked you to do, let's say, a quiz on that, you even did well, maybe even got a perfect score. But then when it comes to writing, then there's a mix of structures. You forgot what you have learned. And then when it comes to speaking, definitely you made a mistake and forget all about it. And that's okay. That's very normal because we go through the process of acquisition. We learn it, and sometimes we do well with quizzes or with drills on that. But when it comes to free writing, we forget again the concept about that. And totally, we don't remember it when we speak. That is because when we learn our level of acquisition, there are different levels. So it's only when we can utilize a certain grammatical structure or vocabulary in our free speech that we can say, I have acquired this specific concept or this specific grammar rules. Free speech is like the highest level when it comes to language learning. That's why many can say, I can understand more than I can express. For many of you, when you do maybe your reporting, your presentation, you prepared well, you understand the topics, but when it comes to discussion, you can't say everything that you thought you understood. And that's part of the level of acquisition. Until we are so comfortable, so familiar with the topic that it has become deeply ingrained in us, part of you, then that's when we can utilize it. Okay. Even sometimes I can see this with my son, and apologies for always using this because this is only one of the places where I can see and try to notice. When he hears a specific word, um, most likely from the shows that he watched, he will try to use it. And oftentimes he will not be able to use it properly. Just like earlier, he used the word aroma. And then he said, yeah, I'm just testing, or I can't exactly remember the context that he used it, but he tried to use the term aroma. And then I said, do you understand what aroma means? And then he said, yeah, aroma is coffee. I said, what do you mean coffee? Aroma is smell. Uh, how something or someone smells. So because the term is, I think he has seen that on TV or what, that they use the term aroma to advertise coffee. So he thought that aroma and coffee are synonymous. And so sometimes, okay, you just get some sort of idea, but it's not very clear yet. And that's okay, that's part of learning. But we have to be careful with the last one, fossilization. Because once something we have heard or we have used something and we continually use it, then it becomes part of our system. It has been internalized, then it will become fossilized. So now, if improper grammar or pronunciation rules are internalized, even with training, they may never be corrected. This is one of the sad things, and also one of the main reasons why sometimes pronunciation and accent are very difficult to change already with adults, is because of this as well, except for also the hypothesis of critical period. So once you are used to improper or erroneous speaking, pronunciation, or even grammar structure, once it's already internalized, it's difficult to unlearn it. So once you are still starting to learn something, if you're learning something new, make sure that you do it correctly the first time. It's constant correct practice that makes perfect. Constant practice will only help you fossilize something that you have learned, but if it's wrong, then that's the thing. It's difficult to unlearn it. That's the reason why, if you are teaching adults speaking and listening and they have learned English for quite some time, teaching them pronunciation might not be a good idea anymore because most of the things that they have learned have already been fossilized and it's difficult to correct them. So unless you present a new material, even though they have learned English for quite some time, if it's new material for them, then maybe they can still learn something. So it's very important that we practice. When we learn something new, we make sure that we learn it properly and accurately so we can form good habits and hopefully we get the correct one. So what does it entail when it comes to classroom activities? Learning versus acquisition in the classroom. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to we have to give a balance between activities that support learning and activities that promote acquisition. So yes, you give instructions, you give uh, drills, but at the same time allow them opportunity for free speech to communicate more authentically. High interest, low vocabulary. Although comprehensible input um, suggests I+1 when it comes to listening and speaking, it should be easier than their current level. Usually for reading or writing, they have to have one step higher than their current level. But when it comes to speaking and listening, this should be one step lower than their current level. But the interest should be high. Very interesting, very fun game or activity, but the vocabulary should be low. Because remember, when it comes to levels of acquisition, they may understand it, but it doesn't mean that they will be able to use it properly. Correctness versus fluency. It's important that when you provide activities in the classroom, you have to identify what is your goal for that specific activity. Do you want them to get it correctly, or do you want to help them develop fluency and at the same time confidence in speaking? Because when you want correctness, then you would keep repeating or focusing on drills until they get the correct pronunciation or grammar properly. But when it comes to fluency, you might be more forgiving and disregard some of their mistakes to ensure that they develop fluency. Repetition. Again, we go back. Retention and comprehension. It doesn't mean that because they understand, they can recall it. So repetition is very important. Comprehension and retention. We go back again here. Yes, one lesson is not enough. It has to be repeated to ensure that students can recall the concepts. And then exposure and practice. We need to increase exposure to the lesson that we want them to learn. So this one, I have asked you to read it and then I'm exposing you again to the same concept through this discussion, and majority of some of the things that we have discussed here have already been exposed to you before. But when it comes to language teaching, let's say speaking again and listening, it's not enough for a teacher to only speak or for a few students to speak or ask for volunteers to speak. That's the reason why in the classroom we always, okay, especially when speaking and listening, you ask them to turn to your peers, turn to your neighbors, group work to increase more mouths talking at the same time. So this is a challenge also if you're teaching a language class in online setting. Good thing in MS Teams we now have some breakout rooms to ensure, but again, supervising each groups is still an issue or a challenge. But the main idea here is to give students more opportunities for practice, for speaking, and usually group work or pair work would give them that time. Finally, do we assess oral skills? If you're teaching a beginner class, the main rule is don't assess. Why? Because speaking is already very complex, very complicated task. When they speak, they have to think about the grammar, their fluency, what word to use, their pronunciation, that they have to worry about so many things just so they can speak, that if you keep on grading them, it might be a frustrating aspect. However, if you are already teaching a more advanced class, then there might be really a need or a necessity to grade. When we do tasks and if we need to correct errors, we have to ensure that we only correct errors and not mistakes. What are errors? Errors are the actual erroneous utterances that students use, in which students make, in which they don't really know the rules, while mistakes are just, slips. For example, sometimes for us Filipinos, we might make mistakes by saying he instead of she for a woman. And normally that's a mistake. Why? Because we already know the concept that for a female it's he, for a female it's she, and for a male it's he. Only that in our native language we don't, identify that. We only have one pronoun for both male and female. So it's understandable to make that mistake. An error is really you make something that is wrong because you don't know the rule. However, we have to find ways to fix errors without calling attention to them. Or else our speakers, language learner speakers, might get frustrated. So if we have to assess, we should prepare a rubric if there is a need to assess. And consider the nature and the length of the speaking task for the oral assessment. The sample that was given there in the article was very simple. That's because, let's say, if the speaking task is very short, you don't want a complicated rubric. I know majority of you here are education majors, and maybe you are taught how to create a really good, solid rubric, and that's really good. But for speaking, when it comes to assessing language skills, let's say they're going to speak for 3 to 5 minutes, and then you have a very detailed rubric. It will take you 5 minutes or more to fill it up. That's not very wise. Although you have a good rubric, but you will be so focused on finishing your rubric that you cannot focus on the task that your students are giving you. So if the speaking is just very short, your rubric should just be very simple, that you can finish it right away, that you can take time to focus on the task, and then at the same time, after you finish listening to the task or viewing the task, you can grade. So a very detailed rubric would be good for, let's say, a 30-minute to 1-hour presentation. So the nature and the length of the speaking task should be considered when creating your rubric. Finally, my last words, what do we have to remember? Oral skills should be taught deliberately, carefully, and with great attention to the student's level and ability, such that success is guaranteed and students are encouraged to continue practicing. Our goal as language teachers is to encourage our students to pursue their journey in achieving communicative competence in the target language. So thank you very much. If you have questions, you can still send me a personal message, and after this, definitely I have a question for you to answer. Thank you. God bless.